the loudest voice. There is a certain place where dumbwaiters boom, doors slam, dishes crash. Every window is a mother's mouth bidding the street, shut up, go skate somewhere else, come home. My voice is the loudest. There, my own mother is still as full of breathing as me, and the grocer stands up to speak to her. Mrs. Abramowitz, he says, people should not be afraid of their children. Ah, Mr. Bialik, my mother replies, if you say to her or her father, shh, they say, in the grave it will be quiet. From Coney Island to the cemetery, says my papa, it's the same subway, it's the same fare. I am right next to the pickle barrel. My pinky is making tiny whirlpools in the brine. I stop a moment to announce, Campbell's tomato soup, Campbell's vegetable soup, Campbell's vegetable beef soup, Campbell's Scotch broth. Be quiet, the grocer says, the labels are coming off. Please, Shirley, be a little quiet, my mother begs me. In that place, the whole street groans, be quiet, but steals from the happy chorus of my inside self not a tittle or a jot. There too, but just around the corner, is a red brick building that has been old for many years. Every morning the children stand before it in double lines which must be straight. They are not insulted. They are waiting anyway. I am usually among them. I am, in fact, the first, since I begin with A. One cold morning, the monitor tapped me on the shoulder. Go to room 409, Shirley Abramowitz, he said. I did as I was told. I went in a hurry up a down staircase to room 409, which contained 6th graders. I had to wait at the desk without wiggling until Mr. Hilton, their teacher, had time to speak. After 5 minutes, he said, Shirley? What? I whispered. He said, my, Shirley Abramowitz, they told me you had a particularly loud, clear voice and read with lots of expression. Could that be true? Oh, yes, I whispered. In that case, don't be silly. I might very well be your teacher someday. Speak up, speak up. Yes, I shouted. More like it, he said. Now, Shirley, can you put a ribbon in your hair or a bobby pin? It's too messy. Yes, I bawled. Now, calm down. He turned to the class. Children, not a sound. Open at page 39. Read till 52. When you finish, start again. He looked me over once more. Now, Shirley, you know, I suppose, that Christmas is coming. We are preparing a beautiful play. Most of the parts have been given out, but I still need a child with a strong voice, lots of stamina. Do you know what stamina is? You do, smart kid. You know I heard you read The Lord is My Shepherd in assembly yesterday. I was very impressed. Wonderful delivery. Mrs. Jordan, your teacher, speaks highly of you. Now listen to me. Shirley Abramowitz, if you want to take the part and be in the play, repeat after me, I swear to work harder than I ever did before. I looked to heaven and said at once, oh, I swear. I kissed my pinky and looked at God. That is an actor's life, my dear, he explained. Like a soldier's, never tardy or disobedient to his general, the director. Everything, he said, absolutely everything will depend on you.
That afternoon, all over the building, children scraped and scrubbed the turkeys and the sheaves of corn off the schoolroom windows. Goodbye, Thanksgiving. The next morning, a monitor brought red paper and green paper from the office. We made new shapes and hung them on the walls and glued them to the doors. The teachers became happier and happier. Their heads were ringing like the bells of childhood. My best friend, Evie, was prone to evil, but she did not get a single dement for whispering. We learned Holy Night without an error. How wonderful, said Mrs. Glace, the student teacher. I think that some of you don't even speak the language. We learned Deck the Halls and Hark the Herald Angels. They weren't ashamed and we weren't embarrassed. Oh, but when my mother heard about it all, she said to my father, Misha, you don't know what's going on there. Kramer is the head of the tickets committee. Who? Asked my father. Kramer. Oh, yes, an active woman. Active? Active has to have a reason. Listen, she said sadly. I'm surprised to see my neighbors making tra-la-la for Christmas. My father couldn't think of what to say to that. Then he decided, you're in America, Clara. You wanted to come here. In Palestine, the Arabs would be eating you alive. Europe, you have pogroms. Argentina is full of Indians. Here, you got Christmas. Some joke, huh? Very funny, Misha. What is becoming of you? If we came to a new country a long time ago to run away from tyrants, and instead we fall into a creeping pogrom, that our children learn a lot of lies, so what's the joke? Ah, Misha, your idealism is going away. So is your sense of humor. That I never had, but idealism you had a lot of. I'm the same Misha Abramovich. I didn't change an iota. Ask anyone. Only ask me, says my mama. May she rest in peace. I got the answer. Meanwhile, the neighbors had to think of what to say, too. Marty's father said, you know, he has a very important part, my boy. Mine also, said Mr. Sauerfeld. Not my boy, said Mrs. Kleig. I said to him, no. The answer is no. When I say no, I mean no. The rabbi's wife said, it's disgusting. But no one listened to her. Under the narrow sky of God's great wisdom, she wore a strawberry blonde wig. Every day was busy and full of experience. I was right-hand man, Mr. Hilton said. How could I get along without you, Shirley? He said, your mother and your father ought to get down on their knees every night and thank God for giving them a child like you. He also said, you're absolutely a pleasure to work with, my dear, dear child. Sometimes he said, for God's sake, what did I do with the script? Shirley, find it. Then I answered quietly, here it is, Mr. Hilton. Once in a while, when he was very tired, he would cry out, Shirley, I'm just tired of screaming at those kids. Will you tell Ira Pushkoff not to come in till Lester points to that star the second time? Then I roared, Ira Pushkoff, what's the matter with you? Dope? Mr. Hilton told you 5 times already, don't come in till Lester points to that star the second time.
Ugh, Clara, my father asked. What does she do there till 6 o'clock? She can't even put plates on the table? Christmas, my mother said coldly. Ho ho, my father said. Christmas, what's the harm? After all, history teaches everyone. We learn from reading This Is a Holiday, from pagan times also, candles, lights, even Hanukkah. So if they think it's a private holiday, they're only ignorant, not patriotic. What belongs to history belongs to all men. You want to go back to the Middle Ages? Is it better to shave your head with a second-hand razor? Does it hurt Shirley to learn to speak up? It does not. So maybe someday she won't live between the kitchen and the shop. She's not a fool. I thank you, Papa, for your kindness. It is true about me to this day. I am foolish, but not a fool. That night, my father kissed me and said with great interest in my career, Shirley, tomorrow's your big day. Congrats. Save it, my mother said. Then she shut all the windows in order to prevent tonsillitis. In the morning, it snowed. On the street corner, a tree had been decorated for us by a kind city administration. In order to miss its chilly shadow, our neighbors walked 3 blocks east to buy a loaf of bread. The butcher pulled down black window shades to keep the colored lights from shining on his chickens. Oh, not me. On my way to school, with both my hands, I tossed it a kiss of tolerance. Poor thing, it was a stranger in Egypt. I walked straight into the auditorium, past the staring children. Go ahead, Shirley, said the monitors. 4 boys, big for their age, had already started work as prop men and stagehands. Mr. Hilton was very nervous. He was not even happy. Whatever he started to say ended in a sideward look of sadness. He sat slumped in the middle of the first row and asked me to help Miss Glace. I did this, although she thought my voice too resonant and said, "Show off." Parents began to arrive long before we were ready. They wanted to make a good impression. From among the yards of drapes, I peeked out at the audience. I saw my embarrassed mother. Ira, Lester, and Meyer were pasted to their beards by Mrs. Glace. She almost forgot to thread the star on its wire, but I reminded her. I coughed a few times to clear my throat. Miss Glace looked around and saw that everyone was in costume and online waiting to play his part. She whispered, "All right, then." Jackie Sourfield, the prettiest boy in the first grade, parted the curtains with his skinny elbows and in a high voice sang out, "Parents, dear, we are here to make a Christmas play in time. It we give in narrative and illustrate with pantomime." He disappeared. My voice burst immediately from the wings to the great shock of Ira, Lester, and Meyer, who were waiting for it but were surprised all the same. I remember, the house where I was born."
Miss Glace yanked the curtain open, and there it was, the house, an old hayloft where Celia Cornblue lay in the straw with Cindy Lou, her favorite doll. Ira, Lester, and Meyer moved slowly from the wings towards her, sometimes pointing to a moving star and sometimes ahead to Cindy Lou. It was a long story, and it was a sad story. I carefully pronounced all the words about my lonesome childhood while little Eddie Bronstein wandered up and down the stage with his shepherd's stick, looking for sheep. I brought up lonesomeness again and not being understood at all except by some women everyone hated. Eddie was too small for that, and Marty Groff took his place, wearing his father's prayer shawl. I announced 12 friends, and half the boys in the 4th grade gathered around Marty, who stood on an orange crate while my voice harangued. Sorrowful and loud, I declaimed about love and God and man, but because of the terrible deceit of Abby Stock, we suddenly came to a famous moment. Marty, whose remembering tongue I was, waited at the foot of the cross. He stared desperately at the audience. I groaned, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" The soldiers who were sheiks grabbed poor Marty to pin him up to die, but he wrenched free, turned to the audience and spread his arms aloft to show despair, and in the end, I murmured at the top of my voice, "The rest is silence, but as everyone in this room, in this city, in this world, now knows, I shall have life eternal." That night, Mrs. Cornblow visited our kitchen for a glass of tea. "How's the Virgin?" asked my father with a look of concern. "For a man with a daughter, you got a fresh mouth, Abramovich." "Here," my father said kindly, "have some lemon. It'll sweeten your disposition." They debated a little in Yiddish, then fell in a puddle of Russian and Polish. What I understood next was my father, who said, "Still in all, it certainly was a beautiful affair. You have to admit, introducing us to the beliefs of a different culture." "Well, yes," said Mrs. Cornblow. "The only thing, Charlie Turner, the cute boy in Celia's class, a couple of the others, they got small parts or no part at all. In very bad taste, it seemed to me. After all, it's their religion." "Ach," said my mother, "what could Mr. Hilton do? They got very small voices after all. Why should they holler? The English language they know from the beginning by heart. They're blonde like angels. You think it's so important they should get in the play? Christmas, the whole piece of goods, they own it." I listened and listened until I couldn't listen anymore, too sleepy. I climbed out of bed and kneeled. I made a little church of my hands and said, "Hear, O Israel," and I called out in Yiddish, "Please, good night, good night." "Shh," my father said, "shh, yourself," and slammed the door. I was happy. I fell asleep at once. I prayed for everybody, my talking family, cousins far away, passers-by, and all the lonesome Christians. I expected to be heard. My voice was certainly the loudest.
So good.
That's amazing. It's such a great story, isn't it? Okay, so the next section of my Oh, I know. I know. This is how the event producer here is trying to kill me off. So let's begin now with a few Grace Paley moments, if that's okay with the panel. And I don't know, who would like to begin? Victoria?
Okay. So I'll start with when I first got to know Grace, I was a kid. I was living in New Hampshire. I was going to college at Dartmouth, and Grace lived, as many of you know, part-time between New York and Thetford, Vermont. And I was politically active, and the Vernon nuclear power plant was something that we were protesting, and Grace was in an affinity group. I've been thinking about this because I've been thinking about the idea of affinity groups and how great they were, and that we should all now be in affinity groups again. But Grace was in a different affinity group, and I was in one. And we went down to Vernon to demonstrate, and so we're all hanging out there, and people were staying the night. At that period of time, I was in a big body brace. It went from my neck all the way down to my pelvis. So it was very kind of rigid event. And I decided that it was going to be impossible for me to sleep on the ground at the demonstration. And so I was going to get in a car and drive back up north. And as I'm leaving, Grace says, "Oh, honey, where are you going?" I said, "I have to go north. I can't really sleep on the ground." She's like, I said, "I feel terrible." And she said, "You feel terrible? We are so safe here, all of us. And you have to go out in the dark all by yourself." I thought, at the time I remember laughing, right? And then that was Grace, to me. One of the things that was so important for me in my life as having Grace in it was that she was a poet. She started as a poet and then became a short story writer, and I started as a poet. And so pretty much everything I wanted to do, when I knew Grace had done it, it was like permission for me. Like, oh, Grace is a mother, I can become a mother. Grace is a short story writer, I can do that too. Grace taught at Sarah Lawrence, I now teach at Sarah Lawrence. So I've just sort of tried to go in the path. But my one other sort of embarrassing anecdote, and then we can move on, is that I would visit Grace and Bob at their house up in Thetford. And after the first time of my coming there, she started saying to me, "Don't show up if you don't have poems." So I showed up one time, and I was no longer a student. I was living down in Western Mass, working and trying to write poems. And I'd driven up to visit, and we'd all gone for a swim. And then we were back at the house, and Grace had to leave to drive to the airport and fly from Lebanon Airport back to New York. And suddenly, so I'm hanging out with Bob, and suddenly there's Grace again. Oh my gosh. We're like, "What's wrong, Bob? What's wrong? What's wrong?" And she said, "I crashed my car into Victoria's car." So my car was my very first car. It was brand new. I felt so bourgeois for feeling so bad. I was like, my hero has just crashed my car. And Bob saying, "Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's just dents. It doesn't matter." And I'm thinking, oh no, it's my brand new perfect car. And Grace was so flustered. And then she looked up and she said, "Are you joking, Bob? That's what insurance is for." I thought, oh, right. She's also a grown-up in the room, And off she went, and she's like, "Don't worry about it. Just you file it with insurance. We don't, any of us, pay. That's the good news, Victoria." Stop there for that. That's pretty fun. Someone else?
I would love to be next. I studied with Grace at Sarah Lawrence during her first year of teaching. I don't think she may have taught a little bit elsewhere, but she was really new to it. And it was a class that they only had that one time, which was called Senior Seminar, and they had senior writing students in both prose and poetry, and they had all of the writing teachers in the same room working with us. There were only like 5 writing teachers at the time. And I had signed up to have conferences with Grace. You met individually with one of them. But I wanted to be a poet. I didn't want to be a fiction writer. I was writing imitations of Yeats and of John Ashbery, which probably was an early sign of, I shouldn't go in that direction. But Grace had the idea, this is very Grace, that everybody who came in writing fiction should write at least one poem, and if you thought you were a poet, you should try fiction. So I did a couple of voice pieces for her, people I had grown up with, and then I wrote a long story that turned out okay, It was about a character who obsesses and daydreams all the time. I don't know where I got that idea from. But it was later, a few years later, it was actually published in a feminist literary magazine. It was a coherent story, whatever else you could say about it. And she told me that, she told everyone that fiction was about character. I can still sort of hear her saying that in her particular voice and accent. And that she had also learned that a story could be organized like a poem. And I don't think she meant about image. I think she meant that it could circle around meaning the way that a poem did. So both of those things were things that I took with me. I still wrote poems for a while that were sort of confused imitations of poets that I liked. But once I had graduated and was living in New York and had more of a life, I really wanted to write about people. I wanted to write about character. And fiction beckoned. And it was really because of Grace. I mean, she had a huge effect on me that way. The other things I learned from Grace were to revere the often stylized ways people tried to convey themselves. She had a lot of respect for the kind of the curlicues that people made when they were trying to be themselves. And I also learned from Grace something about how to allow humor in the most serious kinds of stories. The thing I always blame Grace for is her tolerance for slowness as a writer. She preached a doctrine of a story takes as long as it takes, and she herself could spend years on a story. So many of the time I have secretly thought I would be a speedier writer if it weren't for Grace. Maybe I should have had a snappier person as my example. But actually, by this time it's all worked out. I've caught up with myself. I like my own pace. I'm a little faster. I once asked her when she moved to Vermont, when she was going back and forth, if she had more time to write since she was, in the country. And she said no, that she was politically active in Vermont as well. She always said that she grew up knowing that being political was a serious way to be. She probably phrased that better than I am, but that was the gist of it. And writing was never her sole occupation. And one last story I will tell about Grace is when I was at Sarah Lawrence, it was during the Vietnam War, so we were always having demonstrations and what were called teach-ins, which you sat and listened to someone analyze why we were in Vietnam. Usually the professors mostly did that. So I had spent an entire day going to everything and sitting and listening to people pontificate. And I was running to the dining hall to get some supper. And as I'm trying to sort of sit down to eat, there's a whole group that appears in the doorway of the dining hall, and they're about to march on the Bronxville Railroad Station to enlighten the commuters about what's going on with this war. And Grace sees me and she says, "Joan, what are you doing there?" So, of course, that day I ate no more. I got up and walked with Grace.
That's great.
Yeah, I always remember that. So, of course, we all think of her every minute now. I mean, I'm so sorry that we don't have her with us in our time of trouble. But I think we're all proud that she was the writer who led us in all these ways.
Hilma?
I think I met Grace first. I'm not even sure. I think the first time I met her, I was teaching at the University of Iowa, and I was living for the semester in the student union. where guests stayed. And Grace was coming to give a reading and a talk, and she stayed there too. And she called me on the phone and said, "Hi, this is Grace Paley. Can I come over?" And it was the voice of my neighborhood. And she taught me to write. She gave me permission to write in the voice of my neighborhood. And she came up and we sat on the twin beds in my room, chewed gum, and talked in the voice of our neighborhood. And it was just wonderful. It was wonderful to know her. I'd already read her. Another time, I was outside leafleting for a candidate that didn't get elected. The usual thing. And it was a very dispiriting experience. I think this was Mondale and Farrar. I had already been hit by some old woman hit me with her pocketbook. I remember another time I was protesting outside an A&P that was selling scab grapes, and women went in and bought the grapes and came out and threw them at me. So it was discouraging, to say the least. And there I am on the corner of 86th Street and Lexington Avenue shouting, "Get that actor out of the White House." It was really wonderful to stand on a street corner, scream like a crazy person. And out of the subway was Grace Paley. And she threw her arms around me and said, "Good for you, good for you." And I felt so incredibly happy, even after the election. And the other thing is a story I think she told me about being arrested at a demonstration and going to the Women's House of Detention and being put in a holding cell with some prostitutes who asked her what she was in for. And she said, "Political protests." And the woman said, "Get these fucking housewives out of here."
So Grace was my teacher at Sarah Lawrence, and I was a transfer student, and I was already old and writing, and I knew I wanted to take class with her, and I got there, and everyone said, "Oh, you'll never get in because Grace has been away for a year. So everyone wants to take the class." And I had grown up in a very politically active family, so I wore my no nuke staff shirt, which was very, whatever, working it in whatever way I could. Anyway. And I did get into the class, which made everyone hate me, which I hadn't seen that coming. But, I learned so many things from her, and I'll just tell you a couple things. One was that Grace was a feminist who loved men, and that's been a huge thing that I have always carried with me, because she was entirely supportive of women's lives and women's work and women's career, and she loved men. And that, when we think about what is feminism, what does it mean, and is though somehow a choice has to be made, and it taught me a choice doesn't have to be made. And the embrace with which she held people, and even reading this, there's certain words like dope, dummy, crummy. Those are all Grace words. She would say to you, like, "What are you, a dope?" And as a student at Sarah Lawrence, I would go in and you have these conferences with your teacher for like half an hour once a week. So it's like therapy. But with Grace, I would go in, and every time I would go in, she would either be rolling around on the floor or crouched on the radiator or always doing something out. And I just taught myself like not to react. She's like, "Oh, my back," or like, "Oh yeah, I'm on the radiator, I can't," you're like, there was always something happening. And I was thinking, she always would read while chewing gum, and I wanted to do it without choke while I tried to do it. But there was about her this incredible authenticity, and it was not, I think in some ways people sort of wrongly thought because of the way she sometimes sounded that it was naive. It wasn't naive at all. It was incredibly layered and complex and nuanced. So there's that piece of it. And then I'll just say two other things. One was that she talked a lot about, which and one of my students is here tonight, about writing the truth according to the character, which was huge. It wasn't about what you thought about something. It was about what is true for that character. What is their point of view and their perspective. And it's not all about you as the writer, which is a huge thing. And then later, when I sort of was no longer, or maybe I don't know, whatever. She was home in New York City on 11th Street, and I went to bring her this short story that I'd written. And so you go to Grace's, and there's always a million things happening and whatever. And so we're sitting at the table, and there's stories that she's writing. She's got like half a story in her pocketbook, half under a plant somewhere. It's always, I'm not making it up, truly chaotic. And then people would see her like that and say, you're just doing that. And she would look at them like, what, are you crazy? This is me. So the phone rings and she picks it up like, oh, Morty, how are you? I love you. I haven't seen you. Where you been? Of course I'll come. Of course I'll go to whatever. Of course I'll do whatever. Oh, tell me it. I'll see you next Wednesday. She hangs up. Why'd you let me say yes? Which was so great because she would agree to everything and do everything for everybody. So I was and I was always saying, like, let me try to help you get organized. Like I was 12, you know what I mean? Like, what did I know? But then I had written this one short story called Looking for Johnny, and it later was part of Safety of Objects. And in it, this boy is kidnapped, and I couldn't figure out the ending. And unlike a lot of writing teachers who don't really tell you anything, Grace was perfectly happy to tell you exactly what to do and what was wrong, but in wonderful ways. And in the end, she's like, I go, Grace, I can't figure this out. She goes, well, he brings the kid back. I'm like, what? The kidnapper brings the boy back. I'm like, why? He goes, because it's not the right kid. He kidnapped the wrong kid. And I mean, it's on the one hand, she was right, and I thought it was a great, and then I, of course, I had to figure out how to do that. But she was this incredibly, I mean, as you're hearing, but warm and generous and feisty, and, you know, she was also like Yoda. I mean, she was like a real, she just embraced, I think, all of us, and gave, like, truly of herself in ways that were, I don't know, profound, you know.
It's so interesting that she was living so much in her time and in the moment in such an engaged way. But the stories have such reach and are so enduring to people who didn't experience that world at all and maybe didn't understand it very well or were very removed from it. But the stories have such power across all those borders. Why do you think that is?
Because they're human stories. I mean, she wrote about people, and she wrote about relationships, and she wrote about love, and a kind of passion and commitment, you know. And so there's an organic nature to that is just human. I think that's really, to me, I mean, I don't know.
One of the things I always sort of steal from Grace when I'm teaching is she said that stories are all about blood and money, blood meaning family or love. And hers really, it's right in front, you know, it's right on the top.
Blood and money. Yeah.
I think of what Harry Crews said, that the best quality you can have when you're writing is mercy. And I think she really had that.
Victoria,
Yeah, there's also, she just was crazy for language, right? And she heard it, and she pulled it in, and so even if it's not the language that you heard in your world, in your neighborhood, you heard the authenticity of language, and she never pulled it back. You know, she never. She wasn't doing it to say I can do this and then let me show you some other moves. She had so many moves and they're all in play. You know, so there's just a kind of propulsiveness in the fiction. I had the opportunity once to interview Grace for a magazine, and it was, you know, it's as you were describing. We were also babysitting for Sienna, who was a baby. We, I think we locked the keys out of the car when we went to the supermarket. You know, a million things happened, but she had just had a story published in the New Yorker, so I wanted to ask her a bunch about that story, and it was really interesting in terms of how she worked. So that's just, she said, well, I keep these folders, and when I start to write something and then it stinks, I put it in the folder. And then every once in a while I look at it to see if it has something. And she said, so this is a story that was like 20 years old. She said, I'd looked at it a couple of other times, but this time when I looked at it, I took it out and I started working, and I kept working. And I thought, oh, it doesn't stink so bad. And then I was working, and then and she got it going. But she also said she worked on multiple stories at once. So it's kind of, you know, the energy inside the story is natural to her. It's like her physical being kind of on the page in that way, that kind of energy.
When you talk about language, she used to tell the story about when she was taking a class of poetry at the New School with Auden. And Auden said to her, she wrote some poem, and she said, you know, in the morning I put on my trousers. And Auden said, why are you using the word trousers? And she said, well, because it's the word you use. And he goes, well, what word would you use? And she goes, well, pants. You know? But that was part of, because she so admired, you know, his use of language. And then it's just interesting how it flows down. He encouraged her to use the language that was hers, and of her neighborhood. Yeah.
It's so interesting that as you describe her life seems so full and chaotic but the stories seem in a way so precise and so the resonances of what's left out of the story sometimes is what makes the stories so interesting. And I wonder if you have thoughts about the way that she constructed stories, because they're so, it's as if she had 1,000 ways of constructing stories, but and yet every story is so identifiably a Grace Paley story. Why is that? Other than just
I think there's also a compression to the storytelling. There's nothing in there that doesn't need to be in there. She was, one of the things that, she worked on a lot was editing. And I thought that was one of the greatest lessons that I ever got from her, was that sense of really, that when students know, when I say, oh, you have to revise your story, and they turn it back and there's 2 sentences that are changed. And I'm like, okay, change 2 sentences. But Grace would literally sit there, crossing out things and moving things around, and on her own things, you would see these pages that she'd written, and she always literally, in whatever bag she had, there was at least something she was working on. And it was very physical, and I think there was an absolute precision to that. And she didn't stop until she had it that way, and you sense that compression and specificity. So there is a lot that is taken out. And that's really hard to learn, by the way.
Well, Joan said before that she had taken things from poetry, and one of the things she said to me was, because I was praising the way that she often sort of will not show the stitchery. Sometimes in a writer you just feel this stitchery, and with Grace I was like, there are these huge leaps, and she said, oh, that's something I learned in poetry. She said, first of all, I hate transitions. So I don't like transitions, so why? And I don't think I'm good at them, so I'll just not do them. And she said, but that was the other thing I learned from poetry, was that the reader knows how to make leaps. And so I can make leaps on the page, and if I do it right, I can bring the reader right with me.
Yeah, I could imagine that she probably had the same passion I had as a child for the movies, where the same thing happens. You don't see the cowboy leaving the bar saying, I'm going back to the ranch, and you don't watch him travel on his horse for 10 miles back to his ranch. The next thing you know, you're at the ranch. And I think that if somebody from her family is here can say that she loved the movies the way I did as a kid, that this was possibly another influence in addition to poetry. But it's the details.
She used to say, you could just say time passed or later. You didn't have to account for
or even do a line space.
Exactly, yeah.
Right. This line, my pinky is making tiny whirlpools in the brine. The pickle, that little detail is so visual and so true. And even though there isn't usually a pickle barrel and there isn't a grocer anymore, it exists in memory and it exists on the page, and it's still true. And it still lives. Chekhov still lives, and Grace.
It's also a sentence that sounds beautiful. It sounds.
Yeah, I loved reading it.
She was very big on having students read aloud in her classes. She made you hear what you were doing.
Yeah.
I think there's lots of talk about which writers have influenced a whole generation of writers. Hear about it all the time, but I really do think Paley has had an enormous influence on the writing of stories in America. And do you feel that as well? And do you see it in your own writing, and do you see it in the writing of others? She has an impact on the way because of the way she lived and because her stories are beautiful. But I think it's also,
there's so many pieces to that, I think, because on the one hand, I think of writers like Amy Hempel. I think Amy Hempel to me is definitely sort of a Paley descendant, and Amy never had her as a teacher. But I also think how Grace talked about the differences between men's fiction and women's fiction, and how, in a way, women were supposed to write the small and the domestic and not sort of larger scale. And she would always say things like that women have always done men the favor of reading their work, and men have not returned that favor. Which was so, so I think in those ways too, that it's, when I think about Grace's influence on young male writers, I'm not sure, but then I think there is this whole generation, Laurie Moore and Amy Hempel and just lots of us that I think definitely also were empowered by her, and not just the language, but, which is a big piece of it, but the kind of the freedom, the voice. I mean, the freedom to have a voice in those ways.
And the freedom to use domestic experience,
Yes,
which definitely
yes.
she gave me.
Yeah.
To say that domestic experience has literary value, it's right there in her stories. The two men, the husbands.
Yes, absolutely. And she talked a lot about Tilly Olsen too. She was a big,
I was just thinking of
Yeah.
Tilly Olsen
Yeah.
when you said that, yeah.
She also international writers like Bucci and Macheda. She would introduce. I mean, she would say, "Oh, you have to go look at this." Who wrote this incredible book called Motherhood, that's in about Africa. I mean, she was also, as much as she was an activist here, she was a global citizen from her neighborhood, which was pretty remarkable.
Someone once asked her if it was her political life that stopped her from writing a novel, and she said, "No, I can't write a novel. That's why I didn't write
She
one."
had tried.
Yeah, she said, "I can't do it. There's nothing has interfered with it. It's my fault," she said.
I was looking at this story again and I love this move, so I just need to just point it out. So you're in the thick of that's the story, and it's so in the voice of the child. And then she does these turns, and it's such a thing she can do inside of a story. We're in it, and then she goes, "I thank you, Papa, for your kindness. It is true about me to this day." So she just pulls the text. We're entirely in the moment, and now we have an acknowledgement that there is another moment. There's a moment way beyond this scene that the speaker is speaking from, although, there's been no preparation for it. There's no nod to it again. Sorry. She just does it, and it's happened, and she doesn't take a curtsy. She just keeps moving. And it's so
It's funny, when you read that, I was
impressive.
thinking too of how much she loved her father, because her father was a doctor, and she just worshipped him.
Yeah.
And even in that line, there's that weird thing that it's not an autobiographical story, but I took that line and that moving out as an autobiographical sort of nod.
I think that what you were saying about her invitation to bring women's experience, whatever that was, to bring any experience you wanted. So political, whatever was in it, was a kind of great permission. I think it was a great permission for women writers. I don't know about men, although I know many men who have loved
Absolutely,
her work.
right.
I think it was a love for the ordinary, or experiencing the ordinary as extraordinary.
Yeah.
Extraordinary enough to write about. Even this one line, and the risk of sentimentality, taking that risk rather than writing a cold story that keeps the reader at a distance, to say, there, my own mother is still as full of breathing as me. I lost my breath at the moment I first read that. It's just wonderful. It's so sad. It's so heartbreaking. And yet she's allowing sentiment in without sentimentality. And there's a very big difference.
I want to go back to that question someone asked, Paley. Has your political activism kept you from writing? Because in recent months, I see lots of exchange with writers I know about their inability to write or their inability to get back to work. And
That's depression.
Yeah. and their need to be writing letters and emailing and doing things. And I wonder if you all could talk a little bit about that, about what kind of example Paley sets for us, and also what the real challenge of working and getting your work done and being in a moment where political activism is really called for.
I have sort of two pieces on that for Grace. So I remember interviewing Grace also once for something and asking her, does a writer have more of a social or political responsibility because of being a writer and playing that role? And she said, absolutely not. That a writer had the same responsibility as a plumber, which is to just do the best job they could. And I think she really felt that way. So I think that it was not, she didn't privilege one over the other. They existed side by side. And then just to talk for a second about what you were asking about what it is happening now, I think certainly for me, I remember this having witnessed 9/11, there was that sense that in order for me to do my work and be in my imagination, I had to feel that the world around me was like going to stay put for a minute. And there was literally that sense, of bearing witness to the World Trade Center falling and all that I felt that suddenly what was happening in my waking life was far beyond what I could imagine and what I could conceptualize. And I didn't feel able to leave that, which is like, I equate it now with how I watch TV, like I'm rubbernecking the news. I'm like, what? And it's very hard to keep driving forward while you're just going, what? So I think that there is something about that we feel, that certainly for me, I feel like I can't even write fast enough to write in the moment that we're in, because suddenly that moment is accelerating very rapidly and strangely.
Like all of us, I think we're all thinking about it a lot. It's hard to calm the mind enough to lose yourself in that other place that you want to go to. If it's like, if I don't hover over this, some really false sense of control, right? Like I'm going to save it. But it's part of why I've been also thinking about the whole affinity group thing, because I keep thinking that I've come back in my mind to this night that I left my affinity group because I had to do something different. And it does make me think that if I know that I'm part of a larger movement of people who are working, that different people can take breaks when they need to. Mm-hmm. If somebody has to go take care of a father, and they, all sorts of people called me up apologizing that they weren't at the march. I had to go take care of my dying father. Okay, well, you couldn't be at the march, but that desire to be in two places at once, and that, and I almost went, well, my being there was for you being there. That's a piece of it, and I remember once at another political demonstration, maybe the Women's Pentagon, I don't remember which, some march, also despairing and saying, this is the worst possible moment of all time to Grace. And she said, I was like 12 also. She looked at me and she said, it's been a lot worse before. It's going to be a lot worse again.
She was right about that.
Right? It's been a lot worse. It's pretty bad now. It's going to be a lot worse again. But it's also a lot better now than it was then. And she just looked at me and she said, it takes a long time to make a good world.
She was not a cynical person at all. She was an incredibly optimistic person. That was the other thing. Is she could look at something just so awful and then find something in it like, well, but he's got, his mother still loves him. She would say something. But she was very generous in that way, which is also what you're talking about, that she could find something positive in the midst of,
Even in this story, you get different points of view. You really do.
Yep.
Mr. Hilton is so interesting. The teacher is so interesting. He's almost like the middleman of this story between the Christians and the Jews.
Right.
I think that the confusion for writers now is, a friend asked me if I wanted to contribute to a literary magazine that was, political stories for the moment, very short pieces. And I said, I don't do that. I didn't say it righteously, it's just not the kind of writing I do. And I think for all of us, it's how we want our work to be towards, a morality much needed at the moment. How directly is that going to happen, within? So each writer sort of has to find her or his own way of doing that. And I think that's the struggle now. You don't want to be oblivious, but you don't want to write clunky stuff that's inappropriate for you also.
Right. But Paley never seemed to do that. She always seemed to be a political and social activist, but the stories are the stories. Obviously, there's a conversation between the two, but the stories are the stories. They're not polemical.
Right, not at all.
No. That's one of the reasons I've lasted, obviously.
Yeah.
One of the reasons they're good.
One of the reasons they're good. I wonder do you mind if we open it up a little bit to questions from the audience? We have time, I think, for a few questions. Yeah. So would anyone like to begin? It's hard to go first, I know, but you don't do it. Yeah, go ahead.
But it's not really a question. I was a good friend of Grace. places. So I would just contribute more.
Chime in.
And first by saying that I'm a writer. Alex Schulman is my name, and she was the reason that I began to write. And why? She wrote about, this was at a time in the early 60s when there was no feminist movement whatsoever. The whole literary world was in a stranglehold of men. The best thing that any critic could say about a woman's work was she writes like a man. I mean, it's very difficult for people who weren't alive then to even believe how horrible it was. And there was Grace, and Tilly Olsen, there was Grace writing about taking your kids to the park. There were reviews in the Times Book Review. I used to have a little collection that said, another book about baby carriages. I mean, it was so contemptuous of women's experience and women daring to write. And there was Grace defying it all. And we were neighbors, and I was taking my kids to the same park, Washington Square, and I thought, she can write about taking your kids to Washington Square Park, so can I. So I think there were many of us, not of the young generation, but of just a few years younger than she was, her contemporaries almost, who were also very much liberated to be writing by the existence of Grace. Yeah. Another thing I want to say is that we were political comrades, and she was a few years older than I, maybe 10, I don't know. And I wrote a novel, and she liked it, and she brought me along. She got me into Penn. Later, she promoted me to the board of directors, and after that, to be a vice president. And why? Because I was a feminist and an out feminist, and she thought that Penn would benefit by having that. And she told me to get onto the, the committee that chooses new members. And she said, because there you can really do some really good work and get a lot of women into the organization. So of course I did that. And one other thing I want to say about Grace, we would walk uptown together. We lived only blocks from each other. We would walk uptown from all those board meetings at 10. And walking up 6th Avenue would take a very, very long time because she would stop and talk to every single person on the street. All the street people, the people with their cups out for money, every grocer, every person. She was the doyenne of the neighborhood, really.
But Alex, what's so wonderful is I'm a Penn person, Victoria's a Penn person, Hilma's a Penn person, right. And literally, I remember when Grace was the vice president of Penn, and I remember also, it's been one of those, there have been very few, there's only been, I think, 2 women presidents ever in Penn's history. They always get to be the vice president, and then that's it. But also,
I was a vice president.
Absolutely, right, exactly. And that was after the big fight with Norman Mailer, and that was when Penn had the women's committee, and then probably, 10 years ago, everyone kept going, why do we have a women's committee? What does it do? Because no one could remember anymore.
Well, that ended.
No.
But at the big international congress, individually and then gradually collectively, we all began to recognize that there were no women on any of the panels and there were no people of color on any of the panels. And so we began to form a group. And about 200 of us ended up in a room with Grace Paley and Margaret Atwood as our leaders. And I remember Margaret Atwood addressing Norman Mailer and saying, "Sorry, I'm not here in my native costume."
That's so great. Do we have another question?
I was just going to say something.
Yeah.
I love the way she writes about children. She really makes the small big, like her sense of scale of children is amazing. And I was wondering if you had any stories about Grace and her children.
I just remember her, I mean, in that she loved her kids enormously and loved her family. And she was somebody who would just, lived everything in full embrace. And I don't know her children or any of them here, but I do have the sense that, on the one hand, I think it would be hard to be her kid because she was so generous with everybody. You could be like, Mom, hey, what about me? You know what I mean? She was always just giving to everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm a niece, and I
Yeah.
know that Danny and Lauren loved her, but they found that she was so surrounded by
Yes,
so many
exactly,
other
yes.
people.
It could be annoying.
It was quite difficult.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Another question? Yeah, Linda.
Just having read the story and then hearing you talk about her, it's just so interesting that it's such a reflection of one another. I think that partly the rhythm that, as Lynn mentioned, the child, it's so, she lets each character speak for it's his or herself, but you don't know quite, but they're not predictable. You're not quite sure when the little girl says, you asked her, you have such a loud voice, and she talks in a little voice. The way you did that so beautifully.
She's so beautifully
I don't know what
perverse.
she's gonna say next.
Right.
And then when the teacher asks her to tell the boy what to do, and she speaks in kids speak, doesn't she? And of course he's going to understand. But there's each character so much themselves in the voice, and it's so, and there's a niceness that comes out about it. You know, this girl has obviously been chosen because she's done something well, but the parents don't praise her to death.
Right.
And I'm sure Grace didn't do that with her children. So it's just interesting the way you talk about her and the way these characters are, that it sort of reflects a very sane, healthy world in a way.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that in that story in particular, the sense of surprise and multiple surprises comes not from plot twist, but out of character. How the character
Completely.
surprises you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think they last because she talks about how we live in families, in communities. And as the world changes, that doesn't really change. We still live in our little subgroups in a certain way. We still relate to each other in a certain way. And there's so much sympathy, so much empathy for everyone around her in her stories without ever being mushy, being very straightforward, but clear about the relationships we have with one another. And I think this is what makes them last, the stories last.
Hilma, it's amazing that you said that she talks about how we live, because I always have described her as the teacher who the best teachers don't just teach you like how to write. She taught me about life. She taught me how to be a person, which is the harder thing to teach somebody.
And reading her fiction teaches you how to live in a way.
Right, well, that's the,
I think we'll end on that note.